He was the man who humiliated Keanu Reeves on national television, laughed as millions joined in. Years later, that same man lay in a hospital bed, forgotten and dying, until a quiet knock echoed at his door. When he looked up and saw who had come to visit, the entire world would learn what true forgiveness looks like. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The lights of the studio burned hot, washing everything in a pale glow that made the audience shimmer like a restless sea. It was a Thursday night in Los Angeles, and the Gavin Cross show was in full swing. Gavin leaned forward in his leather chair, smiling that polished smile that had carried him through a decade of rating success. Across from him sat Keanu Reeves, dressed in a simple black suit, his posture relaxed but his eyes thoughtful. The audience cheered, clapping for the star who had just released another action film. Gavin had a plan that night. He needed a viral moment. His producers had whispered before the show, "Make it fun. Push him a bit people love when you catch the serious ones off guard." He nodded. It wasn't about cruelty, he told himself. It was just television. But deep down, there was envy. Keanu's calm presence, his quiet confidence, the way he never chased attention, it irritated Gavin more than he cared to admit. "So, Keanu," Gavin began, his tone light but laced with sarcasm, "you've been called everything from Hollywood's monk to the quiet philosopher of action movies." The audience chuckled. "Tell me, do you ever say something exciting, or do you just meditate your way through interviews?" Laughter rippled through the crowd. The camera caught Keanu's small smile, polite but strained. He leaned slightly forward, hands folded loosely in his lap. "I just try to be present," he said softly. "Sometimes silence says more than words." Gavin grinned wider. "Ah, deep. Did you rehearse that, or did it come naturally from the universe?" The audience roared again. He had his moment. A little jab, a little tease, it was good TV. But for Keanu, the air in the room thickened. Every laugh echoed like a hammer in his chest, though he didn't show it. He simply smiled, nodded, and took a small sip of water. The segment continued, Gavin pressing harder. He joked about Keanu's quietness, his modest lifestyle, his habit of riding the subway instead of driving luxury cars. Each joke landed with laughter, and the more the audience laughed, the more Gavin felt like a king. He could feel the adrenaline of approval, the electric pulse of control. Keanu, meanwhile, kept his composure. When Gavin called him the monk of monotone, Keanu smiled again, though his eyes momentarily drifted downward. What the audience didn't see was the tightness in his throat, the subtle exhale he used to keep his peace. He didn't argue or snap back. He'd learned long ago that not every battle deserved a response. When the cameras cut to commercial, Keanu leaned over, extended his hand, and said quietly, "Thank you for having me, Gavin." Gavin laughed. "You're a good sport, man. All in good fun. All in good fun," Keanu repeated softly. But there was no bitterness, no sarcasm, just quiet acceptance. He gathered his notes, stood up, and walked off stage as the band began playing. Behind him, Gavin soaked in the applause. The director shouted that the segment was trending already. Gavin smiled wide, unaware that he'd just planted a memory that would never fade. In the green room, Keanu sat alone for a moment, sipping tea. His publicist entered and said, "You handled that well." Keanu shrugged. "He has his path, I have mine." Outside, the laughter from the audience could still be heard through the thin walls, echoing, faintly, like the memory of an old wound beginning to form. He didn't know it then, but one day, that laughter would lead him back into the same man's life, under entirely different circumstances. By the next morning, the clip was everywhere. Headlines called it, "The Night Gavin Cross Made Keanu Crack." Social media turned the exchange into endless memes and short edits. One post read, "Even Neo can't dodge awkward questions." Another mocked his calm demeanor, captioned, "When your Wi-Fi is buffering but you still answer." For days, Keanu couldn't open a browser without seeing his face attached to someone else's punchline. Studio executives laughed during meetings. Even fellow actors sent texts trying to joke it off. He responded politely to all of them, refusing to let anger take root. He had learned through life's tragedies that silence could protect dignity. Meanwhile, Gavin basked in the attention. His producers congratulated him for the spontaneous gold. The network extended his contract, and he walked through the hallways like a man reborn. The studio audience adored him for being fearless, and sponsors loved the engagement numbers. Yet behind the flashing lights and applause, a faint unease flickered in his conscience. There was something in Keanu's eyes that night, a stillness that made Gavin's jokes feel smaller the longer he thought about them. He tried to ignore it. "It's just show business," he told himself whenever guilt whispered. People forget fast, but they didn't. The internet never forgot. The clip lived on, replayed every few months when people wanted to mock Hollywood interviews. For Keanu, it became a quiet test of character. He didn't respond in interviews, never spoke ill of Gavin, and declined every opportunity to set the record straight. Instead, he buried himself in work, channeling his discomfort into calm purpose. He visited children's hospitals, funded silent charities, and continued to live as he always had, without resentment. Yet late at night, when he sat on his balcony overlooking the city lights, that moment would return. The laughter, the cameras, the forced smile that stayed like an echo inside him. Not painful enough to hate, but too sharp to ever forget. That night in the studio had ended in applause. But for both men, it had planted something deeper, an invisible connection between arrogance and grace, humiliation and forgiveness. Years would pass before fate brought them together again, in a place where laughter no longer mattered. Weeks passed, but the sting of that night lingered in ways neither man could have predicted. For Gavin, it was another episode on a long list of ratings wins. But for Keanu, it became an unspoken test of restraint. The entertainment world moved on, yet the interview resurfaced again and again in compilation videos titled Cringiest Celebrity Moments or When Talk Show Hosts Go Too Far. Each time it appeared, Keanu's gentle smile from that night became a symbol mocked by some, admired by others. His fans defended him fiercely, calling out Gavin's cruelty. "Keanu was too kind for that room," one commenter wrote on a trending thread. Another said, "The way he handled disrespect with grace? That's strength." Over time, the internet's narrative began to shift, even though Keanu himself never spoke about it. But the damage to Gavin's image had quietly begun. Behind his charming grin and sharp wit, Gavin started noticing something subtle in his audience. The laughter that once came easily began to sound forced. A segment producer once told him, "People say you went too far with Reeves, but hey, controversy sells." He laughed it off, but it gnawed at him. He replayed the clip late at night when insomnia kept him awake, watching Keanu's steady calm, that moment when his eyes lowered after a cruel joke. There was no anger there, just quiet disappointment, a mirror Gavin didn't want to face. In the years that followed, the contrast between them grew clearer. Keanu's humility became legendary viral stories of him giving up his subway seat, helping stranded drivers, quietly donating to hospitals. Meanwhile, Gavin's sarcasm hardened. The fame he chased began to feel hollow, built on moments like that interview, fleeting triumphs at the expense of someone else's dignity. At one award show, nearly a decade later, Gavin caught sight of Keanu again. The actor was greeting fans outside rather than mingling with celebrities inside. For a brief second, their eyes met across the crowd. Keanu offered a small, sincere nod. Gavin hesitated, unsure if he should approach, but by the time he gathered the courage, Keanu was gone, slipping into a car with the same quiet humility that had always defined him. That silent exchange haunted Gavin. For the first time, he wished he could undo what had been done. But fate doesn't erase. It circles back when you least expect it. The night he mocked Keanu Reeves had made him famous. Years later, that same memory would be the bridge that brought Keanu back into his life, not as a guest, but as a savior. The glow of late-night television began to shift. Newer, younger faces filled the screen's hosts who spoke faster, joked louder, and embraced social media in ways Gavin Cross never could. For 2 decades, his sharp wit and confident grin had ruled the airwaves. But time has a quiet way of humbling even the loudest voices. His decline began slowly. Ratings slipped a little one season, then dropped harder the next. Producers started hinting at format changes, a polite way of saying the audience was bored. Gavin ignored the signs. He told himself the numbers were just part of a cycle. People always come back, he'd say at production meetings, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. But they didn't. Viewers found new idols. Viral personalities on the internet began pulling in millions of views overnight. Funny, unpredictable, and raw. Gavin's carefully rehearsed sarcasm suddenly felt outdated, even cruel in comparison. He tried to adapt, inviting YouTubers and influencers onto his show. But his jokes about internet fame fell flat. The studio's energy changed too. Staff who once adored him started keeping their distance. Younger writers joined the team, pitching jokes that didn't fit his rhythm. "You've got a trend, Gavin," one of them said during a brainstorming session. The audience wants authenticity now, not old-school roasting. Gavin's laugh was forced. He'd built a career on roasting people on witty humiliation, masked as humor. It was too late to reinvent that image. When his show was finally canceled, the announcement came in a short email from the network. "We appreciate your years of contribution to the industry. No phone call, no farewell broadcast, just silence." His office was emptied in a single day. A junior producer he barely knew handed him a cardboard box filled with old photos, a coffee mug, and a gold-plated plaque that read, "10 years of excellence." Outside, cameras waited. Cameras waited. A gold-plated plaque, but not for him. A new celebrity was arriving for an interview at the same building. Gavin stood by his car, unnoticed. The bright flashes meant for someone else. For the first time in decades, he wasn't the one people were looking at. The applause he once lived for had faded into memory. As the sun set over the studio lot, Gavin looked at the massive billboard that once bore his face. It had been replaced by a fresh young comedian grinning beside a slogan that read, "The future of late night." Gavin smiled bitterly, muttering under his breath, "Good luck, kid." Then he drove away, unaware that his greatest lesson in humility was still to come. The years that followed blurred together in a haze of half-hearted projects and desperate comebacks. Gavin tried everything: guest spots, hosting podcasts, even short-lived YouTube experiments, but none of it worked. The charisma that once drew millions now seemed forced, a shadow of what it had been. When he appeared on a digital talk show, one comment beneath the video read, "Didn't this guy used to be famous?" It received thousands of likes. That one comment haunted him. Fame had once wrapped around him like armor, protecting him from reflection. But now, stripped of the spotlight, he faced a truth he'd long avoided. Without an audience, he didn't know who he was. He began spending long nights at a downtown bar where the bartender didn't recognize him. There, under dim lights, he could pretend he was just another man nursing regrets. The drinks helped dull the ache of memory, the laughter, the cameras, the way he'd mocked others for entertainment. Sometimes, someone older would approach, squinting, as if trying to place his face. "Hey, aren't you that talk show guy?" they'd ask. He would force a smile. "Used to be," he'd reply. He told himself the bitterness was just realism, not self-pity. But even he could feel the edge of cynicism creeping into his voice. Friends began to drift away. His ex-wife stopped answering his calls. His daughter, living in Chicago, sent him birthday cards, but rarely visited. When she did, the meetings were polite but distant. Two people connected by blood, but separated by years of absence. By his late 50s, Gavin's health started to decline. The alcohol that once took the edge off now took a toll. His hands trembled slightly when he reached for a glass. The doctors warned him about his liver, but he brushed it off with sarcasm. "It's fine," he'd say. "It's just catching up with my career." The bills piled up faster than his income. The lavish home in the Hollywood Hills was the first to go, sold to cover debts and medical expenses. He moved into a modest apartment in a quiet Los Angeles neighborhood, a one-bedroom with faded walls, a leaking faucet, and an old television that played reruns of shows he once hosted. Some nights, he'd catch glimpses of his younger self on the screen, confident, sharp, untouchable, and he'd whisper, "You really thought it would last forever, didn't you?" The irony wasn't lost on him. The man who once mocked vulnerability now lived it every day. The world had moved on, and he was the only one still watching reruns of a life that no longer existed. By the time Gavin turned 60, the laughter that once echoed through packed studios existed only in his memories. The mirror reflected a man he barely recognized. Hollow eyes, graying hair, skin marked by years of exhaustion and guilt. The sparkle that once made cameras love him had faded into a quiet stare that carried too many regrets. His mornings began slowly. The coffee pot sputtered, the same creaky machine he'd bought 10 years earlier. He'd sit by the window, staring at the street below as life carried on without him. People hurried to work, laughing, calling out to friends. He envied their normalcy. For a man who once had the world's attention, silence now felt deafening. He still received the occasional letter, mostly from older fans who remembered the good years. Some wrote that his humor had gotten them through tough times. Others asked why he disappeared. Gavin read those letters over and over, trying to believe that somewhere, someone still cared. But the truth was brutal. His name no longer carried weight. The new generation didn't know who Gavin Cross was, and the old one had stopped wondering. His body reminded him of his choices. The liver disease that doctors had warned about began to worsen. Some days, the pain in his abdomen was so sharp it took his breath away. The nurse at the clinic suggested inpatient care, but he waved her off. "Save that for someone famous," he joked weakly, though his voice trembled. Evenings were the hardest. He'd pour himself a rungo, glass of water that he wished was something stronger, and scroll through his phone. Occasionally, a clip of Keanu Reeves would appear, a charity event, a random act of kindness, a viral story about him helping someone in need. Each one stirred a strange ache in Gavin's chest. The man he'd once mocked was now loved more deeply than ever. Keanu had become a symbol of decency in a world obsessed with ego. One night, unable to sleep, Gavin rewatched the infamous interview, the one that had once made him feel powerful. As the laughter erupted again, it no longer sounded like victory. It sounded cruel. He watched Keanu's calm, composed face and whispered to the empty room, "You didn't deserve that." Tears he hadn't shed in years welled up. The weight of his past felt heavier than his illness. For the first time, Gavin admitted that what he'd done that night wasn't humor. It was insecurity, disguised as wit. He turned off the television, sat in silence, and felt something inside him finally crack open. That night, alone in his small apartment, Gavin Cross, the man who once made millions laugh, felt a strange mix of pain and peace. His life had fallen apart piece by piece, but deep inside, the first spark of humility flickered. It was faint, fragile, but real. He didn't know it yet, but that spark would soon draw someone back into his life, someone who had every reason to forget him, but never would. While Gavin's world dimmed into quiet solitude, Keanu Reeves lived in an entirely different rhythm, one grounded in simplicity and kindness. The years had been kind to him, not because of fame or wealth, but because he had learned how to carry peace in a noisy world. He still rode his old motorcycle through the streets of Los Angeles, his long hair blowing in the evening wind, often unnoticed by those passing him by. There was something freeing about anonymity, something that reminded him he was still human before he was a name. Most mornings began the same way. He brewed his own coffee, fed the stray cat that wandered onto his porch, and read scripts in silence. He wasn't chasing roles anymore. He was choosing stories that spoke to his soul. Between film shoots, he volunteered quietly at children's hospitals, visiting wards unannounced. He'd sit beside kids hooked to IVs, telling them stories about movie sets, asking about their dreams. Sometimes, he'd simply listen, holding their hands when words failed. The staff would thank him, and he'd always reply with the same humble line, "They're the brave ones, not me." Despite his fame, Keanu lived without extravagance. His home was modest, his lifestyle simple. He donated most of what he earned to causes that mattered: research foundations, housing for the homeless, and scholarships for underprivileged youth. The world saw glimpses of it, but he never sought attention for any of it. "You never lose anything by being kind," he often said, a quiet belief he carried through every interaction. One afternoon, while on a film break, Keanu accepted an invitation to appear on a popular late-night talk show. The host was young, respectful, and full of admiration. The conversation turned nostalgic as they revisited old moments from his career. Then, on the screen behind them, the infamous clip played: the old interview where Gavin Cross had mocked him decades earlier. The host winced clearly, uncomfortable. "That must have been hard to sit through back then," he said. Keanu chuckled softly. "We all have our bad days," he answered calmly. "Even me." Maybe he was having one too. The audience fell silent for a moment, unsure whether to laugh or applaud. Then the applause came, soft at first, then louder, carrying admiration rather than pity. His words weren't sharp or defensive. They were graceful, full of quiet strength. That moment, more than any movie scene, reminded the world why people loved Keanu Reeves, not for his fame, but for his heart. The clip from that interview spread like wildfire overnight. Fans flooded social media, praising Keanu for his humility. "That's real class," one tweet read. Another said, "He didn't defend himself, he defended compassion." Within hours, the moment became a trending headline: "Keanu Reeves forgives without saying a word." News outlets picked up the story, dissecting his response, comparing it to how most celebrities would have lashed out or demanded apologies. But Keanu didn't follow that script. When a journalist later asked him if he still felt resentment toward Gavin Cross, he smiled faintly and said, "Resentment is a heavy thing to carry. I'd rather travel light." That sentence traveled farther than any movie promotion he had ever done. Commentators called it the Reeves philosophy. Universities used it in ethics discussions. Social pages quoted it over serene pictures of sunsets and motorcycles. To the world, it was another reason to admire him. To Keanu, it was just honesty. He wasn't trying to make a statement, he was trying to live one. What no one knew, not even his closest friends, was that he remembered that night vividly. Every camera flash, every laugh from the audience, every second of silence between jokes, it had all stayed with him. But the memory no longer stung. Time, reflection, and empathy had softened its edges. He had learned to see the pain behind, people's cruelty. "Sometimes people hurt others just to hide their own," he once wrote in his journal. Understanding that doesn't excuse them, but it frees you. Keanu continued his quiet life, untouched by the noise surrounding him. When fans praised him for his grace, he redirected the attention. "Kindness isn't rare," he said during an interview on a podcast. "It's just quieter than anger, so people notice it less." Meanwhile, across the city, in a small Los Angeles hospital, Gavin Cross watched the very same clip from his bed. His breathing was shallow, and his skin had grown pale from illness, but his mind was sharp enough to feel every word. The nurse had left the television on, and there was Keanu, older, wiser, smiling, with the same gentle calm that once unsettled him. When Gavin heard Keanu's response, his hand trembled slightly. He turned up the volume and listened again. "We all have our bad days," Keanu said. "Even me." Maybe he was having one too. Gavin's throat tightened. He whispered, "He still remembers." Then, softer, almost to himself, "And he forgave me." Tears formed in his eyes, not from pain, but from something deeper, a strange mixture of shame and relief. For the first time in years, Gavin felt seen, not as the man who mocked someone better than him, but as a man who had once been forgiven without asking. In the days that followed, Gavin replayed that short clip over and over. It became both a comfort and a torment. Each time Keanu's calm voice filled the hospital room, he He felt a strange warmth wash over him, mixed with an ache that pierced his chest deeper than the illness ever could. It wasn't pity, he heard it was grace. Keanu had every reason to hate him, every reason to hold that grudge forever. Yet here he was, speaking with kindness instead of contempt. Gavin had once believed forgiveness was weakness. He'd built his fame by making people laugh at others' flaws, not by trying to understand them. But lying there now, attached to wires and monitors, he realized what true strength looked like. It wasn't in cutting others down, it was in lifting them up when no one else would. And Keanu, the man he had ridiculed to earn a cheap laugh, had become the embodiment of that truth. He asked the nurse, a young woman named Lila, to bring him a notepad. "I need to write something," he said quietly. When she returned, he began scribbling thoughts, shaky but sincere. They weren't jokes or monologues anymore. They were reflections. "He didn't owe me forgiveness," he wrote, "but he gave it anyway, and that's something I never gave anyone." His hand trembled, and a single tear landed on the page, smudging the ink. At the same time, miles away, Keanu was sitting on a wooden bench outside a film studio, sipping coffee as the sun dipped below the skyline. A young fan approached him shyly, holding out a small notebook. "Can I ask you something?" the boy said. Keanu smiled. "Of course." The boy hesitated, then asked, "How do you stay so calm when people treat you badly?" Keanu thought for a moment, eyes on the horizon. "Because anger takes too much space," he said. "If you fill your heart with it, there's no room left for anything else." The boy nodded, not fully understanding, but sensing the weight behind the words. That simple encounter reflected who Keanu had become, a man defined not by the pain he endured, but by what he chose to do with it. Every insult, every loss, every betrayal had shaped him into someone who understood that empathy was not weakness, it was wisdom. That night, as he returned home, Keanu passed a small diner near his street. He saw two strangers arguing loudly inside, and instead of looking away, he stopped, waited for the argument to cool, then quietly paid for both their meals without saying a word. The cashier recognized him and asked why he'd done it. Keanu smiled faintly. "Because maybe tomorrow they'll talk instead of fight." He didn't know that, at that exact moment, Gavin was in his hospital bed, watching a rerun of one of Keanu's films. It was an old favorite, The Lake House. The quiet sadness in Keanu's performance mirrored his own heartache. When the credits rolled, Gavin whispered to himself, "I hope he knows. I'm sorry." The city lights outside his window flickered softly, and for the first time in years, Gavin felt something close to peace. It was fragile, like the last flicker of a dying candle, but it was real. Keanu's forgiveness had found him across years, across silence, across the space between two men who once shared nothing but a painful memory. And in that moment, without ever meeting again, one man's kindness began to heal another man's soul. The winter air in Los Angeles carried a rare chill, seeping through the cracked window of Gavin Cross's apartment. The city outside still pulsed with life-honking cars, laughter from distant bars, but inside, everything was silent except for the hum of an old heater and the shallow rhythm of his breath. His body had begun to fail him. What started as fatigue had turned into something darker: dizziness, pain, and the unshakable sense that his time was running out. When he finally collapsed one morning near the kitchen counter, the ambulance lights painted the walls red and white. He was taken to a public hospital on the east side, where old posters about health insurance peeled from the walls. The nurse at reception asked if anyone should be contacted. Gavin shook his head. "No one's waiting for me," he said quietly. Days passed in a blur of needles, beeping machines, and forms to sign. The doctor, a kind but overworked man named Dr. Reynolds, reviewed his scans with a grave expression. "Mr. Cross, your liver is in bad shape. We'll do what we can, but you'll need long-term treatment." Gavin nodded, pretending to understand. Though the words felt like fog, he didn't ask how long he had. Some truths didn't need saying. His room was small, with faded curtains and the faint smell of disinfectant. The television mounted on the wall played daytime talk shows, the kind he once dominated. Watching them hurt more than any needle. Each smiling host reminded him of who he'd been and how easily the world had replaced him. It was on the third day that Nurse Lila entered his life. She was in her late 20s, with kind brown eyes and a soft voice that seemed immune to the exhaustion surrounding her. When she saw his name on the chart, her eyebrows lifted. Gavin Cross? As in The Gavin Cross Show? He smiled faintly. Used to be. Now I'm just room 208. She laughed lightly, though sadness flickered behind it. My dad used to watch you every night. You were his favorite host. Gavin looked away, embarrassed. Tell him he has terrible taste. Lila shook her head. He passed away a few years ago, but he'd be thrilled to know I met you. For a moment, something in Gavin's heart stirred a small spark of the connection he'd lost. But just as quickly, he buried it. Don't waste admiration on me, he murmured. No one remembers the man who mocked Keanu Reeves. Lila didn't reply. She simply adjusted his blanket and said softly, people remember kindness more than mistakes. Maybe it's not too late for that. Then she walked out, leaving Gavin to the quiet hum of machines and the echo of her words he couldn't quite forget. The days melted into one another, marked only by the sound of the nurse's footsteps and the distant chatter of the hospital staff. Gavin tried to hide his worsening pain, though it became harder with each passing week. His skin grew pale, and his hands trembled when he tried to lift a glass. Yet, his pride refused pity. Whenever Lila offered comfort, he brushed it off with a half-hearted joke. Save the sympathy for someone with better ratings, he'd say. But beneath the sarcasm, Lila sensed something else: fear. It wasn't the fear of dying. It was the fear of being forgotten. She often lingered after her shift, talking to him about the old days. She'd pull up old clips on her phone, laughing at his monologues, his timing, his confidence. You had a gift, she said once. You made people laugh when the world was heavy. Gavin shook his head. I made people laugh at others, not with them. There's a difference. Lila sat quietly, unsure how to respond. In her years of nursing, she'd seen pain in many forms: physical, emotional, silent. But Gavin's kind was different. His body was failing, but his guilt was what truly consumed him. At night, when the hospital halls dimmed and the world outside slept, Gavin would lie awake, replaying moments of his life like reruns he couldn't turn off. The cheers, the applause, the cruel jokes that had once felt like triumphs, they now sounded hollow. He remembered every guest he'd ridiculed, every time he'd used his platform to feel powerful. But one memory rose above them all. The night he mocked Keanu Reeves. He could still see Keanu's expression in that studio light. Gentle, patient, almost sorrowful. He'd been given every reason to retaliate, but didn't. That calm stare had haunted Gavin ever since. You never lose anything by being kind. The line had echoed years later in one of Keanu's interviews, and Gavin had known, without question, that it was meant for men like him. Sometimes, when Lila entered in the morning, she'd find the TV still on, playing old recordings of The Gavin Cross Show. She'd gently take the remote and turn it off. You should rest, she'd whisper. But rest wouldn't come. The hospital's white ceiling became his confessional, and the slow drip of the IV marked time he could never reclaim. He often stared at the window, watching the lights of passing ambulances flicker across the glass. Each siren reminded him that someone else was fighting for life too, someone who might still have people waiting for them. He wondered if anyone would wait for him. That question stayed with him, gnawing at what little peace he had left. One sleepless night, the rain tapped softly against the hospital window, blending with the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor beside his bed. Gavin couldn't rest. The painkillers dulled his body but sharpened his thoughts. Memories came flooding in his first night on television, the energy of a live audience, the feeling of power that came with every laugh. Back then, he'd believed attention was love, and that the sound of applause could fill any emptiness. Now, lying alone in a hospital room that smelled faintly of disinfectant and loneliness, he knew how wrong he'd been. He turned on the television to break the silence. A late-night rerun was playing a younger version of himself interviewing a rising actor. His voice was strong, his smile rehearsed, his jokes crisp. The audience laughed on cue, but now, those same words sounded cruel. They carried the arrogance of a man too blind to see the hurt he caused. Gavin turned up the volume, as if punishing himself by listening. When the commercial break came, he switched channels and landed on a movie. The title caught him off guard, John Wick. He almost changed it, but stopped when Keanu Reeves appeared on screen. There was something hauntingly poetic about it. Two men once linked by humiliation, now connected again through a hospital television. He watched in silence as Keanu's character fought, grieved, and endured loss. There was pain in his eyes, but also humanity, a man surviving grief without bitterness. Gavin whispered to himself, "You always carried it better than I did." Lila entered quietly to check his IV. "You're still awake," she said softly. "Couldn't sleep," Gavin replied. His voice was weak. "I was watching one of his movies." "Keanu Reeves?" she asked. He nodded. "Yeah, I used to make jokes about that guy. Thought he was too slow, too quiet. Now I think, maybe he was just the only one who knew who he was." Lila smiled gently. "I think the world finally caught up to him." Gavin looked down at his trembling hands. "I wish I could say the same." She adjusted his blanket and was about to leave when he stopped her. "Lila," he said, his tone softer than she'd ever heard. "Can I tell you something?" "Of course. That night with Keanu, when I mocked him on my show, I thought I was being clever. Everyone laughed, and I felt invincible. But when he looked at me, I saw something: disappointment, not anger. That's what stayed with me. Not the crowd, not the fame, just that look." He swallowed hard. "I think that was the night I stopped liking the man I'd become." Lila's eyes filled with quiet sympathy. She took his hand and said, "Maybe that was the night you started to become someone else." Her words lingered long after she left. The room grew still again, except for the rain against the glass. Gavin reached for the remote and found the clip online, the interview he'd avoided watching for years. The video began, grainy and bright. There he was, confident, untouchable, smiling as the audience laughed at every cruel joke. Then the camera cut to Keanu, silent, humble, eyes steady. The contrast hit harder than he expected. As the laughter filled the room, Gavin began to cry. The sound of it echoed softly, mixing with the rain. For the first time in decades, he let himself feel it, all the guilt, the regret, the deep shame of realizing how far he'd fallen. From grace, he whispered to the empty room, "You didn't deserve that, Keanu. None of them did." Then, with trembling fingers, he turned off the screen. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was cleansing, painful, and honest. In that stillness, Gavin finally stopped pretending. For the first time in years, he admitted the truth, not to an audience, not to a camera, but to himself. He had been cruel, and it had cost him everything. The ballroom shimmered with crystal chandeliers and polished marble floors, filled with the hum of polite laughter and the faint clinking of champagne glasses. It was one of those high-profile Hollywood charity galas Keanu Reeves rarely attended, but tonight's cause, a foundation supporting children's hospitals, was close to his heart. He'd agreed quietly, arriving without a publicist or entourage, just a simple tuxedo and his unassuming presence that always stood out for its humility rather than its shine. As the evening unfolded, Keanu found himself standing near a small group of film producers, men he'd worked with in his early years. Their conversation was loud, casual, full of the industry's usual gossip. Then one of them said a name that made Keanu pause mid-sip of his water. "Did you hear about Gavin Cross? He's in some public hospital now, liver shot." Guess karma finally caught up with him. The others laughed, one adding, "That guy burned every bridge he had. Not even his ego could save him this time." Keanu didn't laugh. He looked down, feeling a subtle weight settle in his chest. Gavin Cross, the man who'd once humiliated him on national television. It had been decades, yet the memory of that night still lived somewhere deep in his heart. But what struck him now wasn't anger. It was something else, a quiet sadness for how far the man had fallen. When the group noticed Keanu's silence, one of them smirked and said, "You must remember that guy, huh? He made you his punchline once." Keanu nodded slowly. "I remember," he said softly. Then, after a pause, "And I remember that he was just a man doing what he thought he needed to do." His calm tone made them exchange uneasy glances. That night, after the gala ended, Keanu walked out alone into the cool Los Angeles night. The city lights flickered like distant memories, and the echo of those mocking voices followed him to his car. Sitting behind the wheel, he couldn't shake the thought of Gavin lying somewhere, sick and alone. He opened his phone and searched the name Gavin Cross. The results were heartbreaking. Outdated photos, forgotten interviews, and a few scattered headlines about his decline. Finally, one link caught his eye. Former talk show host hospitalized in Los Angeles. He clicked it. The article was brief, almost clinical, mentioning his illness, lack of visitors, and struggles with debt. There was no malice, but there was no compassion either. Just the cold reporting of a forgotten man. Keanu stared at the screen for a long time. He thought about how easy it was for people to turn someone's pain into entertainment, how the same cycle of ridicule that had once targeted him was now devouring the man who'd started it. His heart ached at the irony. He locked his phone, leaned back in the seat, and closed his eyes. The sound of the city faded around him. Somewhere inside, he heard his mother's voice, a memory from long ago, calm and gentle, the kind that stayed even after decades. "Don't let hurt harden you, Keanu. The moment you do, you become like the ones who caused it." He opened his eyes and whispered into the stillness, "I won't, Mom." Keanu sat in his car for nearly an hour, parked beneath the soft glow of a street lamp outside the hotel. His thoughts moved slowly, weighed down by the image of Gavin in a hospital bed. He remembered the smirks of those producers, the careless cruelty in their tone. It wasn't just gossip, it was mockery, disguised as humor, the same kind of mockery Gavin had once used on him. But now it came full circle, and Keanu felt no satisfaction in that symmetry, only sorrow. He scrolled through more articles and stumbled upon a short blog post from a local reporter. It mentioned that Gavin was being treated at Los Angeles General Hospital, Ward C, Room 208. The post ended with a single line that lingered in Keanu's mind. "He has no known family and few visitors." He read that line 3 times before locking his phone again. No family, few visitors. The word stung. Keanu knew that kind of loneliness all too well, the quiet ache of being surrounded by people yet unseen by anyone. He thought about the people who had once stood by Gavin, the audiences who once cheered, the friends who had drifted away when fame faded. The world could be merciless to those who had once been loved loudly and then forgotten. At home, the lights were dim. His motorcycle helmet sat on the kitchen counter beside unopened mail. The quiet hum of the refrigerator filled the empty space. He poured himself a glass of water and stared out the window at the dark horizon. Los Angeles shimmered in the distance, beautiful and indifferent. He remembered that night long ago in the studio, the laughter, the bright lights, the moment he'd felt small but chosen peace over pride. He had walked away back then, letting forgiveness rest quietly in his heart. But now, as he thought about Gavin, something in him stirred again. Forgiveness wasn't just walking away. Sometimes it was walking back. He sat down at the table and thought deeply. Would visiting Gavin reopen old wounds? Would it be seen as pity or publicity? He hated the idea of either. If he went, it had to mean something real, something human. Not a gesture for cameras or headlines, but a choice of empathy over ego. He picked up his phone again, hesitating. His assistant, Maria, would be awake. She handled his scheduling quietly, efficiently, and with complete discretion. Keanu typed a message. "Find out if Gavin Cross is still at Los Angeles General. Don't tell anyone why I'm asking." Then he stopped before pressing send. He stared at the words, rereading them, feeling the weight of what they implied. After a long moment, he deleted the text. He wasn't ready yet. Not out of anger, but out of the sheer gravity of what it meant to face a man who once humiliated him and to choose kindness anyway. He closed his eyes and took a long breath. His mother's voice returned again, softer this time. "Don't let the world teach you how to hate." When he opened his eyes, the decision was already made. Morning sunlight spilled through the blinds as Keanu sat quietly at his kitchen table. The world outside was waking up, birds chirping, traffic beginning to hum, but he remained still, holding a cup of black coffee that had already gone cold. He'd barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Gavin's face as it had looked all those years ago, full of pride and sharp humor. Then the face he imagined now, aged, frail, alone. The contrast wouldn't leave him. He opened his laptop and typed Gavin's name again. This time, he found a short update from a local entertainment site. It confirmed what he already feared. Gavin Cross remained hospitalized, battling complications from liver disease. A photo accompanied the article. Gavin was thinner, pale, barely recognizable. There were no comments under the post, no sympathy, no outrage, just silence. Keanu exhaled slowly, his heart tightening. Fame had a cruel way of erasing people once the applause stopped. He remembered when he'd been a struggling actor, waiting for calls that never came, wondering if anyone would remember his name if he vanished. Now, looking at Gavin's forgotten image, he felt a strange mixture of empathy and sadness. The man who had once used mockery as a weapon had become a victim of the same world that thrived on ridicule. He reached for his phone and finally called Maria. "Hey," he said quietly, "can you do me a favor? Find out which hospital Gavin Cross is in. Room number if possible. And, please, don't tell anyone." There was a pause on the other end. "Of course," Maria said. "May I ask why?" Keanu hesitated, then answered softly, "Because no one deserves to face the end alone." 2 hours later, Maria texted back with the details. "Los Boni, Angeles General Hospital, Ward C, Room 208. Keanu stared at the message for a long time before replying. "Thank you. Keep this between us." He showered, dressed simply in jeans, a gray hoodie, and a worn leather jacket. He slipped on his cap, grabbed a small bouquet of lilies from the local florist, and paused at the door. His heart beat a little faster than usual. It wasn't fear, it was the weight of what forgiveness truly demanded. Before leaving, he looked at a framed photograph on his entryway table. His mother, smiling gently. "You'd tell me this is the right thing," he whispered. "So, I'll do it." When he stepped outside, the air was crisp and bright. He started his motorcycle and rode through the city in silence, passing places where his younger self had once wandered in search of meaning. The wind against his face carried a quiet strength, reminding him that compassion didn't need witnesses. As he neared the hospital, he pulled into the parking lot, removed his helmet, and took a deep breath. The lilies trembled slightly in his hand. "No press, no announcement, just compassion," he murmured, repeating the promise he'd made to himself. Inside the hospital lobby, the nurse at reception looked up and froze for a second, clearly recognizing him. Keanu gave a small smile and said, "I'm here to see a patient, Gavin Cross. Please don't make a big deal of it." The nurse nodded, lowering her voice. "Room 208. Down the hall, to the left." As Keanu walked through the quiet corridor, the scent of antiseptic filled the air. He passed open doors where patients lay resting, some alone, some surrounded by family. When he reached Gavin's room, he paused outside the door, his reflection faintly visible in the small glass window. For a long moment he stood there, remembering that night in the studio, the laughter, the humiliation, the silence that followed. Then he exhaled and gently pushed the door open. The door opened with a soft creak, letting in a thin slice of morning light. Gavin stirred, thinking it was another nurse with his medication. But when he turned his head toward the doorway, his breath caught in his throat. Standing there was a man in a plain gray hoodie, a cap pulled low over his eyes, holding a small bouquet of white lilies. For a moment, Gavin thought he was dreaming. Keanu Reeves stepped quietly into the room. He didn't speak right away. He simply looked at the frail man before him, the one who had once made the world laugh at his expense. The years had changed both of them, but what Keanu saw wasn't the arrogant talk show host of the past. It was a man who had been broken by time and guilt. Lila, standing by the monitors, froze. Her eyes widened as recognition spread across her face. She started, then caught herself. Keanu pressed a finger gently to his lips. "Please," he whispered. "No press, no fuss, just visiting an old acquaintance." She nodded, still stunned, and quietly left the room, giving them privacy. Gavin blinked, trying to make sense of the moment. "You?" he managed to say, his voice barely more than a rasp. "You're actually here?" Keanu nodded, setting the lilies on the bedside table. "I heard you weren't doing well," he said softly. "Thought I'd stop by." The silence that followed felt heavy, yet oddly peaceful. Gavin stared at the flowers, his chest rising unevenly. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered. "After what I did, after the things I said," Keanu shook his head. "Let's not talk about that tonight." He interrupted gently. "You need rest. That's what matters." For a long time, neither man spoke. The room filled with the soft hum of machines and the faint sound of rain beginning outside. Gavin's eyes glistened as he looked at Keanu, the man he'd wronged, standing at his bedside not with judgment, but with compassion. "I thought if I ever saw you again," Gavin said weakly, "you'd look at me the way I looked at you back then, with disgust." Keanu's expression didn't change. "That's not who I am," he said simply. "And it's not who you are anymore either." The words struck something deep within Gavin. He turned his face toward the window, unable to speak. Keanu pulled a chair closer and sat beside him. He didn't fill the silence with small talk or pity. He just stayed present, steady, human. That night, after Keanu left quietly without a word to anyone, Gavin drifted into sleep for the first time in weeks. The weight of years seemed lighter, as if someone had lifted part of his burden and carried it for him. Outside, the rain continued to fall softly against the glass, washing the city clean. The next morning, Lila entered Gavin's room with a new sense of quiet reverence. The bouquet of lilies sat beside his bed, fresh and untouched. She noticed something else too. The old tension in his face was gone. He looked rested, almost peaceful, as though sleep had finally granted him a kind of mercy. When Gavin opened his eyes, his first word was a whisper. "Was he really here?" Lila smiled faintly. "Yes," she said. "He asked me not to tell anyone. I think he meant it." Gavin's lips quivered into the smallest smile. "I thought maybe it was a dream. No cameras, no crew, just him." She nodded. "He didn't come here for anyone to know." Gavin looked at the flowers again. "White lilies," he murmured. "You know, on my show, I used to get flowers from fans every week. Back then, I barely looked at them. I thought they were decorations. But those," he pointed weakly to the vase, "those are different. They feel real." Lila sat beside his bed. "He stayed for almost an hour," she told him. "Didn't talk much, just sat here." "I didn't deserve that," Gavin said. "Not from him." Lila hesitated, then asked softly, "Why do you think he came?" He closed his eyes for a moment. "Maybe to prove that goodness doesn't need an audience. Maybe to remind me what grace looks like." His voice broke slightly. "I spent years laughing at people, pretending I was better than them. He spent 1 hour sitting here, and I finally understood what it means to be decent." The emotion in his words caught her off guard. She reached out and held his hand. "Maybe it's not too late for you to be that kind of person too." He smiled faintly, eyes distant. "Maybe not, but it took a better man to show me how." Later that afternoon, when the doctors came to check on him, they noticed his vitals were stronger. The pain had eased slightly, and the nurse noted his blood pressure had improved. "Whatever happened last night, doctor?" Reynolds said with quiet surprise. "It seems to have done you good." Gavin chuckled weakly. "A visit from an angel can do that." The doctor raised an eyebrow. "Angel?" "Yeah," Gavin said, smiling to himself. "A quiet one, on a motorcycle." When Lila returned in the evening, she found him staring at the lilies again. He looked tired but lighter, his eyes reflecting something she hadn't seen before: hope. "If he doesn't, it's okay. Once is enough. You don't forget that kind of kindness." She smiled. "I hope you thanked him." He laughed softly. "I tried," he said, "but I think he already knew." That night, Gavin fell asleep again, and for the first time in months, there were no nightmares, no regrets clawing at him, only calm. As the lights dimmed and the machines hummed quietly, the scent of lilies filled the room. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the city washed clean beneath the moonlight. The following day was unusually bright. Sunlight spilled through the window, touching the lilies with a soft golden hue. Gavin sat upright in bed, a little stronger than before, his mind still replaying the quiet moments from the night before. The memory felt unreal. Keanu Reeves, standing beside him without a trace of pride or judgment. Not the famous actor, not the man the world adored, but simply a human being offering comfort. Every now and then, Gavin would glance toward the door, half expecting him to return. But Keanu hadn't promised that. He hadn't promised anything at all. He had come without condition, and that was what made the visit unforgettable. It wasn't pity, it was presence. When Lila came in for the afternoon check, she found Gavin gazing out the window. "You're quiet today," she said. "I'm thinking," he replied. "Trying to figure out what you say to someone who gives you peace after you gave them pain." She smiled gently. "Maybe you don't need to say anything. Maybe they already heard it in your silence." He nodded slowly. "When he walked in, I wanted to apologize. I opened my mouth, but the words stuck. Then he said, 'Let's not talk about the past tonight.' I realized he wasn't here for an apology. He was here so I could rest." Lila's eyes softened. "That sounds like something he would do." Gavin turned toward her. "You knew he was special before you met him, didn't you?" She smiled faintly. "Everyone feels that way about him. But seeing it in person, it's different. He carries peace with him, like light that doesn't need to shine too brightly to be seen." That evening, Lila left a note at the reception desk, hoping Keanu might return. She wrote, "Your visit made a difference. He's resting better. Thank you for reminding us what kindness looks like." She didn't know if he would ever read it, but writing it felt right. As night fell, Gavin's room grew dim again. The television flickered softly in the corner, playing an old episode of The Gavin Cross Show. He watched in silence, seeing his younger self confident, smug, full of bravado. It felt like watching a stranger. He turned the TV off and looked at the lilies. "I wish I'd been more like you," he whispered to the absent man. "Calm, kind, real." His voice trembled. "You didn't come to forgive me, you came to show me how to forgive myself." The clock ticked softly in the background. Gavin leaned back, letting the rhythm of the hospital lull him into drowsiness. The heaviness in his chest lifted, replaced by something warm peace. Down in the hospital parking lot, Keanu sat quietly on his motorcycle for a few minutes before starting the engine. He didn't look back at the building. He didn't need to. He knew what the visit had meant, not just for Gavin, but for himself. Forgiveness wasn't about the past. It was about freeing the present. He put on his helmet and whispered to himself, "Rest easy, old friend." Then he rode off into the fading light, leaving behind a man who for the first time in years slept without the weight of shame. Over the next several weeks, Keanu returned quietly, always without announcement. Sometimes he came early in the morning, other times after visiting the children's hospital across town. He'd bring simple things, a book, fresh fruit, or just his company. To the nurses, it was still surreal to see him walking the halls like any ordinary visitor, unguarded and calm. To Gavin, each visit felt like a second chance he didn't deserve. At first, their conversations were awkward. Gavin didn't know what to say to the man he'd once ridiculed. He'd start to apologize, but Keanu would gently steer the discussion elsewhere toward movies they'd both loved, people they'd met, or books that had stayed with them. Keanu's calm presence softened the edges of Gavin's guilt until the silence between them began to feel safe instead of heavy. One afternoon, while the late sun filtered through the blinds, Gavin asked, "Do you ever get tired of people expecting you to be perfect?" Keanu thought for a moment. "Perfection's just another illusion," he said. "What people call perfection is usually peace. And peace doesn't come from getting everything right, it comes from making peace with what you got wrong." Gavin let the words sink in. "I wish I'd known that back then," he murmured. "I built my whole life on being sharper, funnier, louder than everyone else. The moment I stopped performing, there was nothing left." Keanu gave a small smile. "There's always something left. You're still here. That means the story isn't over." Lila, who often lingered at the door pretending to check charts, watched their conversations unfold with quiet awe. The once proud host who used to belittle others now listened like a student, humbled and human. Sometimes, when Keanu told a story about working on set or meeting someone inspiring, Gavin would laugh, really laugh, for the first time in years. It startled the staff the first time they heard it. Sound so unfamiliar that even the patient in the next room smiled. In one of those visits, Keanu noticed a small notebook on Gavin's bedside table. "What's that?" he asked. Gavin hesitated before answering. "Just something I started writing in. Memories. Not of fame or awards, just people I should have thanked, but never did." He picked it up, flipping through the pages filled with shaky handwriting. "The driver who got me home after my first show. The makeup artist who made me look better than I deserved. My daughter for still sending cards. Even the audience. I never said thank you properly." Keanu nodded. "Maybe this is your way of doing it now." Gavin looked down at the notebook. "You think anyone cares?" Keanu's voice was steady, gentle. "You care. That's enough. Sometimes, when we try to make peace with the world, we start by making peace with ourselves." The room fell silent again, but this time, it was peaceful. Lila wrote in her report that evening, "Patient improving. Emotional state. Hopeful." The days began to settle into a quiet rhythm. Keanu's visits became something Gavin looked forward to more than any medication or procedure. Their conversations grew deeper, no longer about the past, but about what it meant to move beyond it. One morning, Gavin looked stronger than usual. He had even managed to shave, though unevenly. When Keanu arrived, carrying a small bag of breakfast pastries, Gavin chuckled. "You're going to spoil me," he said. Keanu smiled. "You used to feed America every night with your words. I think I can return the favor." They shared the meal in companionable silence for a while, before Gavin spoke again. "You know, when I first met you, I thought you were fake," he admitted. "Too calm, too kind. It didn't make sense to me. I was trained to see everyone as competition. When I couldn't rattle you, I made fun of you instead." Keanu didn't flinch. "We all stumble," he said, quietly. "But getting up, that's where grace begins." Gavin looked down, his hands trembling. "Grace," he repeated softly. "I didn't even know what that word meant until now." "You're learning it," Keanu said. "Grace isn't something you're given. It's something you allow yourself to live in." The simplicity of the words broke through years of Gavin's cynicism. He laughed under his breath, shaking his head. "You talk like a monk, you know that?" Keanu smiled faintly. "Maybe I've just met enough pain to know that it doesn't go away by fighting it." Lila entered just then with his medication, overhearing the last line. "He's right," she said, smiling. "Pain doesn't always leave, but it changes shape when you stop running from it." Gavin looked at her warmly. "You two make quite the team," he said. "If I'd met people like you sooner, I might have been less of a jerk." Lila laughed. "You're not a jerk, Gavin. You're just still figuring out who you are." He nodded thoughtfully. "Yeah," he said. "For the first time, I think I'm okay with not having all the answers." After she left, Gavin leaned back, staring out the window where sunlight streamed in through the blinds. "You know what's funny?" he said. "When I used to mock people, I thought I was the one in control. But looking back, I was scared. I thought if I could laugh at others, no one could laugh at me." Keanu nodded slowly. "A lot of people live that way," he said. "But the truth is, the more we protect our pride, the lonelier we get." Gavin sighed deeply. "You ever get lonely?" Keanu paused, his gaze softening. "Sometimes. But I've learned that being alone doesn't have to mean being lonely. When you fill your time with meaning, solitude becomes peace." Gavin studied him for a moment. "You really live that way, don't you? You don't just say it, you live it." "I try to. Life's too short to let anger write your story." That line stayed with Gavin long after Keanu left that day. He wrote it down in his notebook, circling it twice. Don't let anger write your story. For the first time in years, he felt like he was finally rewriting his own. Weeks passed, and the small hospital room slowly transformed from a place of sickness into a space of quiet healing. Each visit from Keanu brought not only comfort, but purpose. Gavin's spirit began to mend in ways medicine couldn't measure. The staff noticed the change. His laughter returned, his appetite improved, and his once bitter remarks were replaced by gentle humor. Even the nurses began lingering a little longer, drawn to the warmth that now filled the room. One afternoon, Gavin was sitting up, pen in hand, when Keanu arrived. "Still writing?" Keanu asked, as he placed a paper bag of fresh oranges on the table. Gavin smiled proudly. "Yeah, this notebook's become my confessional," he said, holding it up. "I've been writing about moments I never appreciated, little things, like the janitor who used to mop my studio floor and still smiled at me after I yelled about the lights being wrong, or the intern who brought me coffee every morning even though I never once remembered her name." Keanu leaned against the windowsill, listening intently. "Sounds like you're remembering the best parts of your story." Gavin nodded. "No, I'm remembering the parts I ignored. Maybe that's the same thing." He flipped to a page near the end. "You know, I even wrote about you," he said. "Not the interview, but the visits. The first night you came here, I couldn't believe it. I thought it was punishment, like you were coming to remind me how small I'd become. But you just sat there, calm as ever. You didn't ask for anything. You just gave me time." Keanu's expression softened. "Time's one of the few things we can give that actually means something," he said. Gavin smiled faintly. "I think that's what you've been giving me all a long time, to remember who I used to be before I started performing for the world." They sat in silence for a while, the kind that didn't need filling. The sound of the heart monitor ticked steadily in the background, a gentle rhythm to their quiet connection. Lila entered with fresh linens and paused when she saw them sitting side by side, both lost in thought. "You two look like philosophers," she teased. "Maybe we are," Gavin replied with a grin. "He's teaching me how to be human again." Lila smiled warmly. "I think you were human all along. You just forgot." Gavin laughed, a sound lighter than any in years. "Then maybe I'm finally remembering." After she left, Gavin opened his notebook again. "You know, Keanu, when I'm gone, I want someone to find this," he said. "Not because I need forgiveness, but because I want people to know it's never too late to change." Keanu placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then keep writing. Let it be your message." Gavin nodded, eyes glistening. "You've got a strange way of showing up exactly when a man needs hope." Keanu smiled. "Maybe that's just what happens when grace circles back." That night, when Keanu left the hospital, Gavin kept writing until his eyelids grew heavy. His final words before sleep were simple but profound, scribbled in trembling ink. "He forgave me before I even asked." Maybe that's what real strength looks like. The news came on a gray morning when the air in Gavin's hospital room felt heavier than usual. Dr. Reynolds entered with a clipboard, his face kind but troubled. Lila followed behind him, glancing at Gavin with quiet worry. "Gavin," the doctor began gently, "we've reviewed your charts and treatment plan. You're responding well, but you'll need another phase of therapy to keep the progress going." Gavin nodded slowly. "All right," he said, trying to sound calm. "What's next?" Dr. Reynolds hesitated before continuing. "Unfortunately, Your insurance doesn't cover the next phase. It's considered extended care. We'll help you apply for assistance, but the approval process takes time, and the costs are significant." "How significant?" Gavin asked. The doctor hesitated again. "Roughly $40,000. The number hit like a blow to the chest. Gavin leaned back in his bed, the color draining from his face. "40,000, he repeated quietly. "I can't even afford the cab ride home." Lila stepped closer. "There are foundations that might help," she said. "We can try." Gavin stopped her with a raised hand. "Don't," he said softly. "I've already taken too much help. I made my life out of taking advantage of people. Maybe this is just the bill coming due." The room went quiet. Dr. Reynolds placed the clipboard down and spoke gently. "We'll do what we can, Mr. Cross. Just don't lose hope." After they left, Gavin sat in silence for a long time. The machines hummed softly beside him, but his mind was far away. He stared at the lilies on the windowsill, now slightly wilted but still standing, and thought of Keanu. The visits had become his brightest moments, but now the shame crept back. He couldn't bear the thought of burdening him. That evening, the rain returned, tapping against the window like a quiet metronome. Lila stopped by before leaving for the night, her expression gentle but sad. "Try to get some rest, Gavin," she said. "Tomorrow's a new day." After she left, the loneliness returned. He closed his eyes and whispered into the darkness, "Maybe tomorrow's my last." But outside, a familiar motorcycle engine rumbled softly into the hospital parking lot. Keanu had arrived again, quiet, unannounced, and unseen. He walked in through the side entrance, cap pulled low, holding a manila folder under his arm. When he reached the billing department, he asked to speak privately with the hospital administrator. The hospital administrator sat behind a cluttered desk, flipping through Gavin's file while Keanu waited patiently. "Mr. Reeves," she said, lowering her voice, "you understand this is a substantial amount. We can work out a partial contribution." Keanu shook his head gently. "No partial anything," he said. "Cover everything, all current bills, and the next phase of treatment." The administrator blinked, unsure if she'd heard him correctly. "That's well generous, but are you sure? We'd need confirmation for documentation purposes." He reached into the manila folder and handed her a cashier's check. "This should take care of it. I'd like this to remain completely anonymous. He can't know who paid." The woman hesitated. "He'll ask. Patients always do." "Then tell him a friend took care of it," Keanu said. "That'll be enough." The administrator nodded, sensing that he wouldn't say more. As he left, Lila happened to be walking by with a tray of medications. She stopped mid-step, her eyes widening when she recognized him. "You're back," she whispered, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. Keanu smiled politely. "Just taking care of a few things." Her gaze drifted to the folder in his hand, then back to his face. She understood instantly, but said nothing. "He'll never forget what you've done," she murmured. Keanu looked down, his expression thoughtful. "He doesn't have to," he said quietly. "He just needs to heal." Later that evening, Gavin sat in his bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. Dr. Reynolds had just stopped by with unexpected news. "Good news, Gavin," the doctor said. "Your next round of treatment has been approved. Someone paid the full amount." Gavin froze. "Paid?" he repeated, stunned. "Who would do that?" The doctor shrugged. "Anonymous donor. You must have a guardian angel." When the doctor left, Gavin turned to Lila, who was organizing his chart. "Do you know who it was?" he asked. Lila hesitated. "I was told not to say." His eyes narrowed. "Then you do know." She smiled faintly but kept her eyes on the papers. "Whoever it was didn't want recognition. Maybe you should just accept it." He stared at her for a long moment, the realization dawning. It was him, wasn't it? She didn't answer, but the silence said everything. Tears welled in his eyes as he whispered, "He's already done enough. Why would he do this too?" That night, after Lila left, Gavin picked up his phone with shaking hands. He dialed the number Keanu had given him weeks before, something he'd never used, fearing it would feel intrusive. It rang twice before a familiar, calm voice answered. "Hey, Gavin," Keanu said. "How are you holding up?" Gavin could barely speak. "You paid for my treatment." There was a pause. "You weren't supposed to know that." "Why?" Gavin's voice cracked. "Why would you do that after what I did to you? After everything?" Keanu's tone remained soft. "Because you're a person before you're a mistake. We all need help sometimes." For a moment, the line went silent, except for Gavin's quiet sobs. He covered his face with one hand, the other clutching the phone. "I don't deserve this," he whispered. "None of us do," Keanu said gently. "That's what makes kindness real." In the hallway outside, Lila stood listening just out of sight. Tears filled her eyes as she pressed a hand to her chest. She had seen countless acts of mercy in her years as a nurse, but nothing like this. Nothing so undeserved, yet so freely given. When the call ended, Gavin lay back, exhausted but lighter than he had been in years. The lilies on his windowsill seemed to glow softly in the lamplight, and for the first time, he whispered a quiet prayer of gratitude for forgiveness, for friendship, and for the kind of grace that didn't keep score. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday morning. A few days after Gavin's treatment resumed, the hospital was quieter than usual. Sunlight drifting across polished floors as volunteers made their rounds. One of them, a college student named Erica, was delivering fresh flowers to the patients in Ward C. She didn't notice who stood at the end of the hallway until she nearly walked right into him. Keanu Reeves was there again, standing outside Gavin's room with a small paper bag of fruit and a calm smile. He was dressed simply as always. No entourage, no cameras, just presence. Erica froze in disbelief, her heart racing. She whispered to another volunteer nearby, "That's Keanu Reeves. He's visiting someone in this wing." She didn't mean harm when she took the photo. It was instinct, a fleeting attempt to capture something beautiful. Keanu leaning slightly toward the open door, listening as Gavin laughed from inside. The image said everything. Two men, once divided by pride and pain, now reunited in quiet forgiveness. Erica posted it online with a simple caption, "Kindness in real life." Keanu Reeves visiting someone at the hospital. No cameras, no press. She didn't know who the patient was, nor did she expect what would happen next. Within hours, the photo spread across every platform imaginable. Twitter, Facebook, Reddit. Everyone shared it, dissecting every detail. Then someone recognized the patient in the background. "That's Gavin Cross," one user wrote. "The talk show guy who mocked Keanu years ago. Is this real?" In minutes, the story exploded. Headlines multiplied. Keanu Reeves visits former host who publicly humiliated him. Forgiveness in action. Keanu's quiet hospital visit goes viral. Commentators couldn't stop talking about it. Morning shows debated the meaning of kindness in a cancel-driven culture. One host said, "Most people would hold a grudge, but Keanu Reeves forgave the man who once made him a joke. That's rare." By evening, the photo had reached millions. Hashtags flooded social media, number forgiving Keanu, number grace in action, number be like Keanu. Fans and celebrities alike praised his humility. "The man forgives when others cancel," one actor tweeted. "That's what leadership looks like." But not everyone celebrated it. Some tabloids turned the story into spectacle, publishing clickbait headlines and digging into Gavin's past mistakes. His old interviews resurfaced, his harshest jokes replayed with new judgment. The world was rediscovering him, but not in the way he wanted. At the hospital, reporters began calling the front desk, asking for statements. Lila fielded the calls as best she could, refusing to confirm or deny anything. When she entered Gavin's room that evening, he was staring at his phone, disbelief etched across his face. "They found out," he said quietly. "It's everywhere." Lila nodded. "You didn't do anything wrong." He shook his head, tears welling in his eyes. "No, but I did everything wrong once. And now the world remembers me for that." Lila placed a comforting hand on his arm. "No," she said softly. They remember you because he forgave you. That's what they're really seeing. Gavin's eyes glistened as he whispered, "He still found a way to make me look better than I deserve." That night, the hospital lobby buzzed with commotion. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes pointed skyward. Reporters with microphones crowded near the entrance, hoping for a glimpse of Keanu Reeves or a statement from the hospital. Cameras flashed every time a door opened. Nurses, frustrated but protective, escorted visitors through side exits to keep things calm. Upstairs, Keanu sat in Gavin's room, unaware of how much the world outside had changed in 24 hours. Gavin's phone buzzed non-stop on the bedside table, each vibration another headline or interview request. He finally picked it up and sighed. "They found the photo," he said quietly. "It's gone viral. I'm a trending topic again for all the wrong reasons." Keanu gave a soft smile. "You didn't do anything wrong this time." Gavin laughed weakly. "That's what makes it strange." He turned the phone toward Keanu, showing an article titled, "The Man Who Forgave the Mocking Host. They're calling you a saint." Keanu shook his head. They should stop. It wasn't a statement. It was a visit. But Gavin could see the sincerity in his eyes. He meant every word. There was no performance in his kindness, just compassion without agenda. The next morning, the hospital received calls from major networks offering donations, interviews, even sponsorships. The staff tried to decline politely. Lila, overwhelmed, pulled Keanu aside when he arrived later that day. "They're everywhere," she whispered. "News crews, cameras, bloggers. They're turning this into a circus." Keanu sighed. "Then I'll leave quietly. I never wanted attention." Lila shook her head. "You shouldn't have to hide kindness because the world wants to photograph it." He smiled at her sincerity, but nodded anyway. "Still," he said, "for him, privacy means peace." Before he left, Keanu stepped into Gavin's room one last time that week. Gavin looked exhausted, his phone face down beside him, the screen still lighting up with notifications. "They won't stop calling," he murmured. "Everyone suddenly wants to hear from the man who mocked Keanu Reeves. They don't care that I'm sick, they care that you forgave me." Keanu pulled a chair closer. "Then don't talk to them," he said simply. "Let them talk. You've already said what matters." Gavin smiled faintly. "You really don't hate anyone, do you?" Keanu shrugged. "It's easier not to carry that weight." The room fell quiet again. The hum of the machines filled the space between them. Gavin looked at the lilies on his windowsill, now fully bloomed, and said softly, "It's strange. For years, I wanted people to notice me. Now, for the first time, I wish they'd forget." Keanu stood, placing a hand gently on Gavin's shoulder. "They'll forget the noise," he said, "but they'll remember what forgiveness looks like." After he left, Lila peeked in and found Gavin staring out the window, a calm smile on his face. "You okay?" she asked. He nodded slowly. "For the first time in my life," he said, "I am." Outside, the headlines still spun, the world still talked. But inside, room 208, there was only peace. The next few days were quiet, filled with the kind of calm that only follows emotional storms. The media attention began to fade as newer stories replaced it, and the hospital slowly returned to its ordinary rhythm. Keanu's visits grew less frequent, not out of neglect, but because Gavin was regaining strength. Each visit ended with gratitude and understanding. No grand gestures, no speeches, just a handshake, a smile, and peace. One afternoon, after a particularly gentle conversation, Gavin found himself alone with a pen and his notebook. The lilies near his bed were beginning to wilt again, and their fading petals reminded him that time was fragile. He turned to a blank page and began to write, not for the cameras, not for the world, but for the man who had shown him grace when no one else would. "Keanu," he wrote, his handwriting shaky but deliberate. "There are moments in a man's life that define who he becomes. For me, that night on your show was one of them. I thought it was victory, but it was shame wearing applause. I hurt someone who didn't deserve it, and for years, I hid behind jokes to avoid facing that truth." He paused, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. Then he continued, "You showed me something I never had the courage to understand. That forgiveness isn't weakness, it's strength I never knew existed. You reminded me that a man's true legacy isn't his applause, it's his kindness. You've given me peace, Keanu. The kind of peace fame, money, or pride could never buy." He stopped again, taking a deep breath as emotion caught in his throat. "When I mocked you, I saw calmness and thought it was indifference. Now I see it was wisdom. You were never trying to win, you were trying to stay kind in a world that rewards cruelty. I see that now, and I'm grateful." By the time he reached the end of the letter, his hands were trembling. The words were imperfect, but they were honest. He folded the pages carefully and slipped them into an envelope. On the front, he wrote simply, "For Keanu." When Lila came in to check on him, she noticed the letter on the table. "What's that?" she asked softly. Gavin smiled weakly. "A thank you I should have said a long time ago. Can you make sure it gets to him?" She nodded, holding the envelope as though it were something fragile and sacred. "Of course," she whispered. Gavin leaned back against the pillow, eyes closing. "Tell him not to reply," he murmured. Some words don't need answers. The sun had just begun to set when Lila left the hospital that evening, Gavin's letter tucked safely in her bag. She didn't take the main road home that night. Instead, she made a quiet stop at a small gated property on the outskirts of the city, a house she had seen in magazines but never thought she'd approach in person. She hesitated for a moment before ringing the bell. A kind-faced assistant opened the door. "Mr. Reeves isn't expecting visitors," she said politely. Lila nodded. "I'm not here for me," she replied, holding out the envelope. "This is from a patient. His name is Gavin Cross. He asked me to make sure Keanu received it." The assistant's expression softened instantly. She accepted the envelope and promised, "I'll see that he gets it." That night, long after the house had gone quiet, Keanu sat outside on his porch. The city lights glowed faintly in the distance, and the gentle hum of crickets filled the air. He had spent the day filming a scene that required anger, yet now all he felt was calm. When his assistant stepped outside and handed him the envelope, he frowned slightly, reading the familiar handwriting on the front. He unfolded the letter carefully and began to read under the dim porch light. The first few lines stopped him cold. Gavin's words weren't polished or rehearsed. They were raw, the kind that come only from a heart stripped bare. As he read, his eyes welled with tears. Every sentence carried the weight of regret and the warmth of redemption. When he reached the line, "You reminded me that a man's true legacy isn't his applause, it's his kindness," Keanu had to pause. He stared out into the fading horizon, breathing deeply as the wind rustled through the trees. It wasn't pride that filled him, it was humility. A reminder that small acts of compassion could ripple farther than any movie or headline ever could. He read the letter twice, then a third time, each reading softer than the last. When he finished, he folded it neatly and looked around for a place to keep it. On the small wooden table beside him was a framed photo of his late mother, smiling gently as if still guiding him. Next to it sat an old book of poetry she'd given him years ago. He opened the book and slipped the letter inside, pressing it between the pages as though preserving a sacred memory. Then he whispered softly, "You'd like this one, Mom. He learned what you always tried to teach me." The night grew still. A single tear traced down his cheek before he brushed it away and smiled faintly. It wasn't sadness he felt, it was release. Back at the hospital, Lila returned to Gavin's room the next morning. He was awake, propped up against his pillows, a faint light in his eyes. "Did you deliver it?" he asked. She nodded. "He has it. I gave it to him myself." Gavin let out a long, quiet breath. "Good," he whispered. "Then that chapter's closed." Lila smiled. "You did something brave, you know. Most people run from their past. You faced it." Gavin shook his head gently. "No, he faced it for me. I just followed his example." When she stepped out, she found herself wiping her eyes without realizing it. Gavin's words had stayed with her, too. She'd seen countless acts of healing in that hospital, but none quite like this two men, once divided by pride, bound together now by forgiveness. That evening, as the sky turned gold outside room 208, Gavin looked out the window one last time and whispered to no one in particular, "Thank you, my friend." The weeks that followed were quiet, marked by soft mornings and long nights. Some days he was lucid and strong enough to joke with the nurses, while other days he drifted between exhaustion and silence. Lila stayed by his side as often as she could, sensing that the fragile balance wouldn't last forever. One morning, when she entered his room, she noticed how pale he looked. His breaths were shallow, each one a struggle. The lilies on the windowsill had wilted completely, their petals scattered across the small table. Lila replaced them with a fresh bouquet, arranging them gently. "He's on the edge again," Dr. Reynolds whispered quietly. "It might be time to call his family, if there's anyone left to call." Lila hesitated, her heart sinking. Then she remembered someone who had become closer than family. She stepped out into the hallway, pulled out her phone, and dialed Keanu's number. He answered after the second ring, his voice calm but tinged with concern. "Lila, is something wrong?" She swallowed. "It's Gavin. The doctor says it's time." There was a long pause. "I'll be there soon," he said. Less than an hour later, Keanu arrived at the hospital, his usual quiet presence filling the space with calm. The staff had long grown used to seeing him there, but this time, something felt different. His expression was solemn, his eyes heavy with understanding. Lila met him at the elevator and led him silently to Gavin's room. Gavin's eyes fluttered open as Keanu entered. For a moment, he seemed confused. Then his lips curled into a faint, tired smile. "You came," he whispered. Keanu nodded. "Wouldn't be anywhere else." He pulled a chair beside the bed and sat down, his hand resting gently over Gavin's frail one. The room was still except for the soft hum of machines and the rhythmic beeping of the monitor. "I read your letter," Keanu said quietly. "It meant a lot." Gavin's voice cracked as he replied, "You read it? I'm glad. I didn't know if it would reach you in time." "It did," Keanu said softly. "It found me exactly when it was meant to." A faint smile touched Gavin's lips. "I wanted you to know that I'm not afraid anymore. You took away the fear somehow. I don't understand how kindness does that, but it does." Keanu's voice was low, almost a whisper. "You don't have to understand it. Just rest in it." The minutes passed in silence, broken only by Gavin's labored breathing. Then, in a voice barely audible, he said, "I wish I'd been more like you." Keanu looked down at him with compassion. "Be at peace," he said. "That's enough." A tear slipped from Gavin's eye. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything." Keanu didn't answer. He simply held Gavin's hand a little tighter, staying beside him as the light in the room began to fade. The heart monitor's steady rhythm slowed to a fragile cadence, each beep echoing through the stillness of the room. Keanu never moved, never looked away. He sat in silence, his thumb gently tracing the back of Gavin's frail hand, grounding him to the world for as long as he could. Gavin's breathing became uneven, a whisper of air between pauses that grew longer each time. Lila stood quietly at the doorway, watching the two men who had once been strangers bound now by grace. She saw no bitterness in the scene, no fear, only peace. The television that had played endless noise for weeks was turned off, leaving the room filled with something purer than silence. Gavin turned his head slightly, his eyes fluttering open one last time. His gaze met Keanu's, tired yet clear. "Do you think people like me can still find redemption?" he asked softly. Keanu leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "You already have." A faint smile crossed Gavin's lips. "Then I guess I can rest." Keanu nodded, his own eyes glistening. "Rest easy, my friend." The monitor gave a few slow beeps before falling into a long, steady tone. Lila stepped forward instinctively, checking the line, then quietly placed a hand on Gavin's shoulder. She turned toward Keanu and shook her head gently. He didn't react. He simply sat there a moment longer, still holding Gavin's hand, his expression unreadable. Neither grief nor shock, just a quiet reverence for a life finally at peace. When Lila reached to cover Gavin with the white sheet, Keanu stood, helping her smooth it carefully over his chest. Then, before leaving, he whispered a simple word of thanks to the man who had once humiliated him and who had, in the end, taught him something about humanity. Lila's voice trembled as she said, "You don't have to stay, Keanu. We'll take care of him now." He nodded slowly. "I know, but I wanted to say goodbye properly." She wiped her eyes, touched by his humility. "He found peace because of you." Keanu looked toward the window, where the first faint streaks of dawn were breaking through the clouds. The city outside glowed softly, washed in pale gold. "No," he said quietly. "He found peace because he was ready to forgive himself." He turned to leave, stopping only to thank the nurses as they entered. His voice was soft, steady, full of gratitude. Then, he walked down the long hospital corridor alone, the sound of his footsteps fading beneath the hum of morning. Outside, the air was cool, the world still half asleep. Keanu stood beside his motorcycle for a moment, breathing deeply as the light of dawn touched his face. Somewhere behind him, a life had ended, but in its place, something beautiful had been restored, the quiet power of forgiveness. As he started the engine and rode toward the rising sun, the city began to stir, unaware that one of its most extraordinary stories had just come to an end. The morning of the rising, and one of its Gordon 2R. The funeral was cool and gray, the kind of quiet day when even the air seemed to move with reverence. The service was small, held at a modest chapel near downtown Los Angeles. A few of Gavin's former colleagues came, their faces subdued and solemn. Lila sat near the front, clutching a folded handkerchief, while Dr. Reynolds stood at the back, hands clasped in silence. There were no television cameras, no reporters. Gavin had wanted it that way. His final request was simple. No spectacle, no speeches from strangers, just a few people who still cared enough to remember him for the man he became, not the one he once was. Outside, a black car pulled up quietly. Keanu stepped out, dressed in a long black coat, dark sunglasses shielding his eyes. He kept his distance, not wanting to disturb the intimate circle that had gathered. To the other mourners, he was just another face, paying his respects until the service began. The priest, a soft-spoken man with silver hair, led the ceremony with gentle words. "We gather not to mourn what was lost," he said, "but to honor what was found, the peace of a soul who made his way home." When it came time to offer reflections, the priest looked around the room. If anyone would like to share a memory, the floor is open. No one moved at first. The silence was heavy, the kind that comes from unfinished apologies and unspoken words. Then, slowly, Keanu removed his sunglasses and stepped forward. Lila recognized him immediately and pressed a trembling hand to her chest. A few heads turned, whispers rippling through the small chapel as realization spread. Keanu stood beside the simple wooden casket, his voice calm but resonant. "Gavin made people laugh," he began, "and sometimes laughter hides pain. I think he knew that better than anyone. But what I'll remember isn't how he made people laugh. It's how he learned to listen. In his last days, he showed more strength than most of us ever will." He paused, his gaze steady on the casket. "We all stumble," he continued softly, "but he found his way back. I'm glad he found peace in the end." The words hung in the air, carried by the stillness of the chapel. No one spoke for several seconds. Then someone in the back began to cry, quietly at first. Then others joined. Even the priest bowed his head. Keanu gave a small nod to Lila, then stepped back, returning to his seat without another word. He didn't stay for attention or comfort. He stayed because it was the right thing to do. Outside, unnoticed by anyone, a young local journalist who had been helping with parking stood near the entrance, recording part of the eulogy on his phone. He hadn't planned to capture anything dramatic, just the humanity of the moment. What he recorded would later touch millions. After the final prayer, the small crowd stepped outside into the cold morning air. The clouds had started to part, revealing thin streaks of sunlight breaking through. It was the kind of light that carried no heat, just quiet clarity. People spoke in hushed tones, exchanging small memories of Gavin the way he used to tell stories. His signature laugh, his sharp humor that sometimes cut too deep, but always came from a place of performance, not malice. Keanu lingered at the edge of the crowd, keeping to himself. He didn't want anyone to approach him. This wasn't about him. It never was. He stood with his hands folded in front of him, eyes fixed on the casket as it was carried toward the hearse. Lila joined him briefly, her eyes red but soft. "He would have wanted you here," she said quietly. Keanu nodded. "He's free now. That's what matters." She hesitated before adding, "He talked about you every day. He said you gave him back his dignity." Keanu looked toward the horizon, his voice low. He gave it back to himself. I just reminded him he still had it. When the service ended, most of the mourners drifted away. Keanu remained for a few minutes longer, waiting until the groundskeeper began to close the chapel gate. Before leaving, he knelt briefly beside the flowers resting on Gavin's casket. His hand brushed across the wood, and he whispered, "Rest well, my friend." He stood and walked toward his car without looking back. The wind stirred lightly, carrying with it the faint scent of lilies, the same flowers that had filled Gavin's hospital room. A few hours later, the short video of his eulogy began to spread online. The young journalist who had filmed it posted it with a simple caption, "Forgiveness in its purest form." The clip was only 30 seconds long, grainy and imperfect, yet powerful. It showed Keanu standing beside the casket, saying softly, "Gavin made people laugh, and sometimes laughter hides pain. I'm glad he found peace in the end." The world responded instantly. Within a day, the video was shared millions of times. News outlets called it one of the most moving moments of the year. Strangers commented things like, "This is what real compassion looks like." Another wrote, "He could have stayed away, but he showed up." Even those who had once mocked or dismissed Gavin began to see him differently. Articles appeared titled, "A Lesson in Grace," and "When Forgiveness Speaks Louder Than Fame." For a brief moment, the internet, usually a place of division and outrage, was united by something simple and profound. Meanwhile, Keanu refused every interview request. When a reporter cornered him outside a studio days later, asking why he chose to attend, he gave only one answer: because no one deserves to be remembered only for their worst moment. That single line became its own headline, a quiet anthem for forgiveness that spread far beyond Hollywood. But Keanu didn't read the articles. He didn't need to. For him, the moment was already complete. By the next morning, Gavin's funeral clip had become more than just a viral video. It was a cultural moment. News outlets played it on repeat, talk shows debated it, and social media filled with emotional reactions. The headlines were everywhere. Keanu Reeves forgives the man who mocked him. Grace in a world that cancels. Hollywood learns a lesson in humility. Every network had its own angle. Some focused on the emotional story of redemption. Others analyzed the symbolism of forgiveness in an unforgiving time. A few tried to dig into Gavin's past again, recycling the old footage of that humiliating interview years ago. But this time, the tone was different. The world wasn't laughing anymore, they were reflecting. Talk show hosts praised Keanu's silence. He didn't post about it, didn't make a statement, didn't sell a story, one said during a primetime segment. He just showed up, quietly, like he always does. That's what makes it powerful. An actor who had once been criticized for arrogance tweeted, "We don't deserve Keanu Reeves. The man leads by example without saying a word." Within hours, that tweet had over 2 million likes. Meanwhile, Keanu stayed completely off camera. He didn't respond to journalists or issue a statement. He returned to his daily routines, riding his motorcycle, working on his film projects, and keeping his word to stay out of the spotlight. But behind the scenes, he made one quiet move that no one expected. Through his foundation, Keanu arranged a donation to a newly revived charity called the Artists Recovery Foundation. It was established to help former entertainers, comedians, musicians, and actors who had lost their careers, health, or sense of purpose. When the donation became public record, it listed a single note attached to the payment, in memory of Gavin Cross, who reminded us that purpose doesn't end when applause fades. That line alone reignited the story. The foundation posted a thank you message saying, "Because of Keanu Reeves' gift, dozens of struggling artists will have access to housing, counseling, and mentorship programs." Forgiveness turned into action. The gesture was covered across every major network, but when reporters reached out for a quote, Keanu declined every request. His publicist issued only a short response. "Mr. Reeves wishes to keep the focus on the foundation, not himself." Still, the public's fascination grew. Commentators described him as the man who leads without trying. One columnist wrote, "In a culture obsessed with vengeance, Keanu Reeves reminded us that redemption still exists. He didn't win the argument, he transcended it." Even Lila, watching from home one night, found herself in tears. The same compassion she had witnessed in that hospital room had now touched millions. She whispered to herself, "He really changed the story for both of them." Over the following week, the story refused to fade. It became something larger than the two men it involved, a public reflection on empathy, forgiveness, and what it means to move beyond the mistakes of the past. News anchors quoted Keanu's words from the funeral. Universities used the story in ethics classes. Online forums turned it into a rare moment of shared positivity amid the chaos of daily headlines. But through it all, Keanu remained silent. He didn't appear on any shows, didn't make a single social media post, and didn't even issue a statement through his agent. The more the world tried to draw him into the spotlight, the more he disappeared from it. To him, forgiveness had already served its purpose. It wasn't meant to be monetized or dramatized. At one point, a well-known talk show host invited him for a primetime interview. "It would mean the world to millions," the host said, "just to hear you speak about why you did it." Keanu politely declined. "I think the story speaks for itself," he said. "It's about Gavin, not me." Instead, he continued quietly funding the Artists Recovery Foundation. When asked by the foundation's board if he'd like to have his name publicly associated with it, he replied, "No, let the help stand on its own." Behind closed doors, the impact was real. Dozens of former artists, writers, actors, and musicians began receiving support through the foundation's new programs. One woman, a retired stage actress who'd fallen on hard times, wrote a thank you letter that ended up circulating online. It read, "I don't know Keanu Reeves personally, but because of him, I have a roof over my head and hope in my heart. He gave us back our dignity." That letter spread almost as widely as the original story. Commentators began calling the entire sequence of events the forgiveness arc. Documentaries were proposed, op-eds were written, and fan pages began collecting stories of Keanu's quiet kindness from across the years. Yet when asked by a small independent journalist if he felt proud of what he'd done, Keanu only smiled and answered, "We're all just trying to be better people. That's enough for me." The simplicity of the quote struck everyone. It was replayed across podcasts, written into magazine editorials, and turned into viral graphics online. "We're all trying to be better people" became a global mantra, printed on shirts, shared on murals, and quoted in graduation speeches. Meanwhile, the studio where Gavin had once filmed his show decided to dedicate a small corner of its lobby to him. On the wall, a framed plaque read, "In memory of Gavin Cross, proof that it's never too late to change." Underneath it was a photograph from years ago. Gavin, mid-laughter, microphone in hand, the audience applauding. But now, that image meant something new. Lila visited the memorial one afternoon. She stood in front of the plaque for a long time, tracing the engraved words with her fingertips. She thought of Keanu, of Gavin, and of how two lives had intertwined to remind the world of something so simple, yet so forgotten. Forgiveness is more powerful than pride. When she left, she passed by a nearby television playing a morning show. The anchor was reading Keanu's quote aloud again, We're all trying to be better people, she said, smiling faintly. Maybe that's the lesson we needed this year. Outside the studio, the sky was clear. The storm had passed, but its message lingered quiet, steady, and unforgettable. Weeks after Gavin's story faded from the trending lists, something unexpected began to grow from its quiet aftermath. The hospital where he had spent his final months was still buzzing with conversations about what had happened. Nurses spoke about kindness during lunch breaks, patients asked about second chances, and volunteers found new purpose in small acts of compassion. For Lila, the change felt personal. She couldn't stop thinking about those final moments, about how forgiveness had transformed a man's last days from regret into peace. One evening, while she was finishing her shift, she looked around the recovery ward and saw so many patients facing their own broken relationships. Some had families who never visited, others who carried anger they couldn't let go of. That night, she opened her notebook and wrote a simple idea at the top of a page: the Grace Project. Her vision was simple: to help patients reconnect with the people they'd lost before it was too late. It wouldn't be about grand gestures or publicity. It would be about conversations, letters, and small reconciliations that could heal hearts before the final goodbye. When she brought the idea to the hospital board, they hesitated at first. Funding was limited, and most initiatives focused on medical treatment, not emotional healing. But Lila persisted. She shared Gavin's story, not the viral version, but the real one. She spoke about the power of that single visit, how it had changed not only one man's life, but the atmosphere of an entire hospital. Her words moved them. Within a month, the Grace Project officially began as a small volunteer initiative. Lila recruited social workers, nurses, and even a few former patients. Their mission was to identify individuals who were isolated or burdened by guilt and help them reconnect with forgiveness, with family, with peace. The program's first success was a retired teacher named Mrs. Hanley, who hadn't spoken to her estranged son in 15 years. With Lila's help, she wrote him a letter. He arrived a week later, sitting by her bedside in tears. Their reunion was quiet, but life-changing. Word spread through the hospital. Soon, other facilities began asking about the Grace Project. Lila received letters from staff at clinics across the state wanting to replicate it. A documentary crew requested to feature the initiative, but she declined politely. "This isn't about headlines," she said. "It's about healing." Still, the story grew. Local newspapers ran features about hospitals embracing compassion-based care. One headline read, "From Forgiveness Comes Healing, a nurse's project inspired by Keanu Reeves." When Keanu read that article months later, he smiled quietly. He didn't call, didn't reach out, didn't try to claim credit. He simply made an anonymous donation to fund the project's expansion, leaving a note that said, "Keep doing what matters." Before long, the Grace Project spread far beyond the walls of Los Angeles General. Hospitals in Chicago, Seattle, and even smaller rural towns began forming their own versions programs centered not on medicine alone, but on reconciliation and human connection. The project's motto, "It's never too late to make peace," began appearing on bulletin boards and hospital newsletters across the country. Meanwhile, something began shifting outside the medical world too. Gavin's story and Keanu's quiet response had awakened something deeper in the public consciousness. It wasn't just another celebrity moment, it had become a cultural reflection. Talk shows that once thrived on controversy started dedicating segments to forgiveness. One morning anchor said, "If Keanu can forgive the man who mocked him on national television, maybe we can forgive someone in our own lives too." Viewers across the country began sharing their stories under a single viral hashtag, #ForgiveLikeKeanu. The posts were raw, emotional, and human. A daughter reconciling with her estranged mother, a veteran forgiving an old friend, a teacher writing to a former student to apologize for harsh words years ago. Each post echoed the same sentiment: empathy is stronger than revenge. The movement caught fire quietly, not as a trend, but as a transformation. It began appearing in sermons, classroom discussions, and therapy sessions. People started asking themselves the same question Gavin had once asked in his final days. Can I still change? Lila was invited to speak at a healthcare conference where she told Gavin's story, not the viral one, but the personal one. Her voice trembled as she described how a simple visit from Keanu Reeves had transformed a hospital ward, a dying man, and eventually an entire movement. When she finished, the room stood in applause. Afterward, a young doctor approached her, tears in his eyes. "I had a falling out with my brother 5 years ago," he said quietly. "After hearing that story, I think I'm going to call him tonight." That, more than the applause, told Lila she was doing something right. Months later, she received a handwritten note in the mail. It was unsigned but simple. It read, "Lila, you turned forgiveness into a living thing. The world needed that. Thank you." She knew immediately who it was from. Across the country, others followed. Keanu's example. A well-known musician publicly forgave a critic who once ruined his career. A retired actor reached out to a director he had wronged. It became more than a moral tale. It became a mirror of who people wanted to be. Even the media, usually hungry for scandal, began covering these small human acts. One magazine ran a headline that summed it up perfectly. "From fame to grace, how one act of forgiveness changed a generation." In the months that followed, donations poured into the Grace Project. With each expansion, more families found closure. More lives ended in peace rather than regret. Through it all, Keanu never spoke publicly about Gavin again. He didn't need to. The silence had become his signature, a kind of unspoken leadership the world had come to understand. And as the movement grew, one truth echoed everywhere. Forgiveness hadn't just healed 2 men. It had reminded millions that kindness could still change the world. The house was quiet that evening, bathed in the soft orange glow of a fading sunset. The city below moved at its usual rhythm, unaware of the thoughts stirring inside one man's home. Keanu sat on his porch, the same spot where months earlier he had read Gavin's final letter. The world had gone back to its noise, to news stories and distractions. But tonight, the past returned to him, with gentle persistence. On the table beside him lay the old book of poetry where he had tucked Gavin's letter. The pages were worn, the corners curled from years of handling. He reached for it, flipping to the page that held the folded note. The ink had faded slightly, but the words still carried the same weight, the same quiet truth that had once brought him to tears. He read it slowly, letting each line breathe. Gavin's words weren't elaborate or dramatic. They were human. They spoke of failure, regret, and the miracle of being forgiven. It reminded Keanu of something his mother had once told him when he was a teenager, struggling to understand the cruelty of the world. You can't control what people do to you, but you can control what stays inside you. For years, he had lived by that principle. He'd faced loss, betrayal, and misunderstanding, but he had learned that bitterness was a kind of prison. Reading Gavin's words now, he felt that lesson all over again. The man who had once ridiculed him had found redemption not through fame, but through humility. And that, Keanu thought, was the truest form of peace. He leaned back, watching the light dim across the sky. His thoughts drifted to his own past, the father who had left, the sister he had loved and lost, the friends who had faded with time. Each pain had been a teacher, each heartbreak a quiet turning point. He remembered nights spent alone on the road, thinking about how easily pain could turn to anger if left unchecked. But somewhere along the way, he had learned to let it soften him instead. He reached for his journal, a simple leather-bound book that he carried everywhere. Its pages held fragments of thoughts, lessons, and reminders written not for the world, but for himself. He opened to a blank page, took a slow breath, and began to write. Pain becomes purpose when you choose not to return it. Forgiveness is freedom without an audience. It doesn't need to be seen to be real. He paused, staring at the words for a long moment, then added another line. The world celebrates anger, but peace is the quieter victory. He closed the journal softly, the sound barely louder than the rustle of the evening wind. The air carried the faint scent of rain, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. Everything felt ordinary, and yet within that ordinariness, there was something sacred. The sky deepened into shades of violet and blue as the last traces of daylight faded. Keanu remained seated, the journal resting on his lap. The stillness around him was comforting, like the world had paused just long enough to listen. He thought about how forgiveness wasn't a single act, it was a daily choice, a decision to keep the heart open even when it had every reason to close. He had spent much of his life learning that lesson. He remembered the anger he once felt toward his father, a man who had vanished when Keanu was still a boy. For years, that absence had followed him like a shadow. But time and reflection had taught him that holding on to resentment only chained him to the past. Letting go didn't excuse the pain, it just made room for peace. Now, reading Gavin's words again, he realized how full circle it had all come. The man who once mocked him had become a mirror, a reflection of what can happen when humility meets compassion. In forgiving Gavin, he had healed something in himself too. The quiet around him felt alive. The wind carried the distant hum of the city, the occasional sound of laughter echoing from a nearby street. It reminded him that life, no matter how painful or unpredictable, kept moving forward. He smiled faintly, thinking of all the people who had been touched by the story of Lila's Grace Project, of strangers writing letters to estranged family members, of the thousands who had chosen kindness because of one small, private visit that was never meant to be seen. He whispered softly to himself, "Funny how the smallest moments become the ones that last the longest." Standing, he walked inside and placed the journal on the wooden shelf beside his mother's photograph. Her smile in the frame was gentle, timeless, the kind that seemed to speak even without words. "You were right," he murmured quietly. "It's not about being perfect, it's about staying kind." He glanced around the room, simple and uncluttered, the way he preferred it. On a side table sat a single candle. He lit it, watching the flame flicker and dance, its glow soft but steady. It reminded him of Gavin's laughter in those final weeks, fragile but bright, proof that even the most broken souls could shine again when shown love. Outside, the first stars began to appear. Keanu stepped back out onto the porch, hands in his pockets, breathing in the cool air. He didn't think about headlines, or praise, or legacy. Those things had never mattered. What mattered was knowing that, in the end, compassion had won not on a stage, not in front of cameras, but in the quiet spaces of the human heart. The city below shimmered faintly under the night sky. Keanu took one last look upward, then whispered into the breeze, "Rest easy, old friend." He sat back down, the candlelight flickering through the window behind him, his face calm and untroubled. The world would move on to other stories, other noise, but this one, this quiet act of grace, would stay with him. And as the night settled, Keanu Reeves sat in the silence of his porch, a man at peace, grateful for the simple truth he had lived to learn: love without pride, forgive without condition, and carry no bitterness into tomorrow. The months that followed saw something rare. A story that didn't fade away, but quietly continued to ripple through the lives of ordinary people. News outlets had moved on, but across America, forgiveness had found a new voice. In classrooms, teachers spoke gently to students about grace. In nursing homes, families reunited after years of silence. In living rooms, people reached for their phones, typing out messages that had waited too long to be sent. It wasn't about Keanu Reeves anymore. It wasn't even about Gavin Cross. It was about what their story had awoken, the simple truth that kindness still mattered. The world, weary from outrage and division, found solace in a story that reminded them that healing was still possible. Clips began circulating online, showing small but powerful acts of forgiveness. A teacher embracing a former student who had once mocked her, two brothers reconciling after decades apart, a mother and daughter sitting together again for the first time since a bitter argument. Each story echoed the same message, that it was never too late to choose compassion over pride. At one small-town church in Kansas, a pastor opened his Sunday sermon by playing Gavin's eulogy clip. He paused the video just as Keanu said, I'm glad he found peace in the end and turned to his congregation. That, he said, is what faith looks like, not in words, but in action. Across social media, people continued sharing their own experiences. If Keanu can forgive someone who publicly humiliated him, one post read, then maybe I can forgive my father. Another said, forgiveness doesn't make you weak. It gives you back your power. The hashtag number Grace Begins Here began trending, connecting strangers who found strength in letting go. Even years later, the story resurfaced every so often, each time bringing comfort to those who had forgotten that kindness still had a goal. Place in the modern world. Teachers played the short clip for students learning about empathy. Counselors used it to help people find closure. Families showed it around dinner tables as a reminder that peace was worth more than being right. And somewhere in Los Angeles, the nurse who started the Grace Project watched with quiet pride as her idea grew beyond anything she could have imagined. Hospitals across the country now had volunteers trained to help patients reconnect with loved ones before it was too late. The initiative had reached thousands, but to Lila, it always came back to one small hospital room. One man who chose forgiveness over resentment, and another who learned how to receive it. She often thought about that night when Keanu first visited Gavin, the lilies on the table, the rain outside, and the unspoken understanding that something sacred had taken place. It wasn't just a celebrity act of kindness. It was the reminder that every person, no matter how flawed, deserves the chance to make peace with their story. As time passed, the story of forgiveness became less of a headline and more of a touchstone. It found its way into documentaries, classrooms, and quiet conversations between friends who hadn't spoken in years. The world didn't change overnight, but something subtle shifted. People were reminded that humanity still had room for grace. In one viral video, a teenage boy visited his estranged grandfather at a veteran's home after watching the Keanu and Gavin story. I figured if they could forgive each other, he said, then so can we. The video ended with a hug that felt like an echo of that hospital room where two men had once chosen peace over pride. Everywhere, moments like that began to surface. A musician reunited with the critic who had once destroyed her career. A father and son reconciled after years of silence. Strangers forgave one another for words said in anger. It was as if one act of compassion had cracked something open in the collective heart of a world that had forgotten how to heal. In Los Angeles, Keanu continued living quietly, still avoiding interviews about the event. When asked during a rare press conference about his legacy, he smiled softly and said, "I'm not trying to leave a legacy. I'm just trying to live kindly. The rest will take care of itself." The reporter nodded, but that quote would go on to circle the internet, carved into digital space like a simple truth people already knew but needed to hear again. Fans painted murals, wrote essays, and created online pages dedicated to what they called the Grace Movement. Yet Keanu never claimed it as his. He saw it as something bigger than himself, proof that compassion doesn't need ownership to grow. Meanwhile, the Grace Project expanded internationally. Hospitals in Canada, the UK, and Australia began adopting its model. Lila became its quiet leader, always refusing attention, always giving credit to the story that started it all. She would often tell volunteers, "Forgiveness isn't about who deserves it. It's about freeing yourself from the weight of anger." Her words carried the same calm power that Keanu's once had. Years later, a commemorative plaque was placed outside the original hospital ward where Gavin had spent his final days. It read, "In this room, one act of forgiveness changed many lives." Visitors often stopped to read it, unaware of the full story, but somehow still feeling its truth. As the film of life faded toward its closing moments, the message that began with a single visit now belonged to everyone. Kindness had proven stronger than ridicule. Compassion had outlasted fame. Forgiveness had turned pain into purpose. And in the final reflection of it all, the truth remained as simple as ever. Kindness doesn't erase the past, it heals it. So, to those watching, listening, or reading this incredible story, a question remains. Have you ever forgiven someone who hurt you deeply? Because somewhere, someone is waiting for that call, that message, that moment of grace that could change everything. And if this incredible story touched you, share it with someone who believes that kindness still matters, because in a world where resentment is loud, forgiveness still whispers the loudest truth of all. Love always wins in the end.